Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. If you're struggling in your marriage, or maybe you're wondering if it's even salvageable, before you give up or before you let things get too hard, let us come alongside you and help you solidify your marriage. We offer biblical encouragement and insight to help you strengthen your marriage. Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. We're Doug and Leslie Davis. Today, we're going to be looking at how to regulate a negative mood.
Well, let's first talk about what an unregulated mood is and what it means to regulate. You'll hear me talk a lot about being on autopilot or being out of control and that sort of thing. But regulation of a mood is a little bit different because when you talk about being unregulated, it's more like being not in center. When a mood is unregulated, it's like your person, your inner self is just not centered. And a regulated mood would speak to the fact that you're centered in that mood, like that mood is okay. And it's not to say that a negative mood is wrong or bad, but most of the time we don't want to stay in a negative mood. And science has said, it's been proven in studies, that the people who can believe that they can regulate a negative mood are less likely to be depressed. Mm-hmm. They're more likely to be happy. Right. They're more likely to succeed in moving from a negative mood state to a positive mood state. Mm-hmm. And so
well, and as a result, their relationships just tend to be better because, all of us have been around folks who have struggled to regulate their mood. We may be one of those folks who've struggled to regulate our mood. And what you've probably noticed, whether you regulate your own mood or not, when somebody's mood isn't being regulated, it's difficult to be around them. If it comes out as anger, it might be anger towards you or maybe critical towards you. And so it's really difficult to stay in a strong relationship. So we really want to focus not only on how you can regulate your mood, but how you can have a better relationship as a consequence of that.
But you talked about anger mostly because a lot of times a negative mood will come out as anger, but a negative mood also comes out as maybe withdrawing or sulking. A negative mood could come out as anxiousness or fear, like at the base of anxiousness is fear. It could also be a sadness or an unhappiness.
The anger issue, being the unregulated negative mood, is the number one issue for the people who are struggling with unregulated negative mood, but it's not the only one. And so there may be something that seems to happen to you a lot, and you don't feel like you can immediately get it under control. And so any of those negative moods that come across in a way that would be damaging not only to your own self-image, but to your relationships, those are the things we want to give you some opportunities to talk about how to regulate them.
So the first thing, of course, is to be aware of your current mood, to be able to pinpoint where it's at on the spectrum. If it's anger, is it more like frustration as coming out as anger, or is it more like a sadness that comes out as anger? Or there are times when it's just the right mood to be is anger, like it's like a righteous anger, or an anxiousness, is it a fear, like a deep-seated fear, or is it just a worry? So defining what that current mood is, being able to put a label on it is always helpful.
And there's a difference between having one of those emotions come across you and seeming to have that become a defining emotion as far as something that becomes more and more and more what people associate with you. Because if you constantly withdraw, even when it's not appropriate to withdraw, that's something that you're going to want to work on so that it won't affect you negatively in your self-image or negatively in your relationships. And again, anger can be exactly the right emotion that you should be showing. But if anger tends to define you, and if anger comes out at very weird and inopportune moments, and if it's doing damage to your own self-image and to your relationships, that's when you need to make sure that you take some of these steps to regulate it.
Absolutely. One of the things, like I tell clients to do in the counseling office, is to when they have a label on what their current negative mood is, to be able to ask yourself, and this is where a spouse can come alongside and help, but to be able to ask yourself, what's the worst thing that can happen? Because if you can talk about the current situation with someone, about the worst thing that can happen, that is going to bring out the tendencies of what you're actually feeling. For instance, we were watching the news. Now, this was during COVID. We were watching the news, and none of it was very positive, but it was creating a very anxious, negative mood in myself. That was my reaction to watching the current news during COVID, or shortly after COVID had hit. And I had to sit down and process, like, what's at the base of that? And I asked myself, what's the worst thing that could happen? Well, in my mind, the worst thing that could happen was I would contract COVID and die, right? Well, that may be a legitimate fear, but the likelihood of that happening probably wasn't that high. And so it felt like, once I talked about it and said, okay, this is the worst thing that could happen, it then turned into feeling like, okay, that's more of an illegitimate fear than an actual, real fear that's based in reality.
And, when we look at regulating negative moods, we are not talking about trying to avoid negative moods, because avoidance is just going to create a problem that becomes much more severe than what Leslie just described. She was able very quickly to figure out what it was that was causing her anxiety, because she was able to press in and look at it rather than avoiding it. But what we see, especially with things like anger, I'll go back to anger again. If you're angry for a legitimate reason and you push into why you're angry, you can deal with it, you can regulate it, you can start to be able to get that anger under control, so that when it's not appropriate for you to be angry, you're less likely to be angry. But if you don't deal with it, what you'll find, and I think all of us have been through this, what you'll find is that you'll get really angry over something that wasn't a big deal. And one of the things for you to realize is you do a good job, your brain automatically does a good job of regulating when you're around people you don't know very well. It regulates a little better than when you're around people you know really well. When you're around people you know really well, your guard is down. And when your guard is down, sometimes those unregulated emotions just come out. And so you may have experienced somebody being really angry because you dropped a box of cereal. And you realize that anger really wasn't something that was merited by dropping a box of cereal. It had nothing to do with that. So if you've ever experienced just extreme emotion, strong mood, and you're not sure why, that's when you really need to press in. When you do it early and you can start dealing with the situation, talking about what's the worst that can happen, you're in good shape. But you may not even realize what it is that's really behind what you're feeling. There's some things you're believing that may not be true, that you haven't dealt with, and now they come out at really weird times.
And that dealing with what you're believing around a negative emotion, a lot of times is where the Lord can work in your life, where God can work in your life, because He's bringing you to a place where He can dispel the lies, or where He can call you to press into a truth that you don't know about Him yet. Maybe He wants to reveal a character trait about Himself that you don't understand yet. And so that's the last one. Like, after you talk about what's the worst thing that can happen, start dispelling the lies that's hidden in that belief of, what is the worst thing that can happen. Because more than likely, the worst thing that can happen is probably not what's going to happen.
Right. And again, you need to look at not only what you're feeling and what emotion you're dealing with right now, but you need to try to press in to find the cause. Because we talked about this last week, and we've talked about it a couple of times, but it's really significant that often the emotion that comes out first is not what the root cause is. There's a lot of issues that come out as anger, but it's not necessarily that anger is the primary emotion, anger is the secondary emotion. What we're really dealing with is a feeling of inadequacy or a lack of security and fear, and the fear comes out as anger, or the lack of self-worth comes out as anger, because what we've found is we've gone into a fight, flight, or freeze mechanism, and if your mechanism is fight, anger can come out really at an inopportune time.
Yeah, negative emotion can certainly come out at an inopportune time when you're triggered. but there's a whole range of negative moods that happens to us that we feel even when we're not triggered. Like what you were just explaining is when somebody might be triggered by an external event. But sometimes internally, we're feeling a certain way that would be qualified as a negative mood, a sadness, an unhappiness, an anxiousness, despondent is one that comes to mind. There's a whole realm, a whole range of negative emotions, and they don't have to be triggered. But one of the things that they found is that when you have a negative emotion, the people who are most likely to overcome that negative emotion are the ones that believe that they can overcome that negative emotion. So it's more about their own expectancies when they have a negative mood. Like, I expect that I will come out of this in a few hours or few days or whatever. Or I expect that I'm going to be able to find something to do in order to alleviate this negative mood. And a lot of times that's subconscious. Like, I remember being in high school, and one of the ways that I dealt with a negative mood was I would find myself shopping at the mall. Now, malls aren't the thing anymore. A lot of malls have died across the United States, but I called it retail therapy, And so that was an activity that I knew would take me from a negative mood to at least a neutral mood. And I could get it done without spending a lot of money.
And being able to name what's going on, being able to call out what you're feeling, and then being able to say, this isn't going to last, I can do something about it, sounds overly simplified, but it's amazing how true it is. It absolutely is step one to being able to grab hold of what's going on, the unregulated negative mood, and to be able to regulate it. And one of the things that Leslie did with her retail therapy was she found something that was self-soothing. And it's amazing how, whether it's anxiety and despondency or if it's anger and frustration, whatever it is that your negative mood is, if you can recognize it, and it doesn't have to be out loud, but at least in your mind, call it by name, recognize that it will not be forever, and then take some steps toward regulating the situation, getting things where they are more in your control. Self-soothing is one of the great things that you can do. Find something that will allow your heart rate to slow down, allow your blood pressure to come down, allow you to be more in the moment, and you'll be able to take a step toward regulating that negative mood.
One of the other things along that lines is as you're talking about lowering your heart rate, taking deep breaths, is also to imagine yourself and your situation in the future tense when things are no longer stressful. A lot of times stress will trigger a negative mood. And being able to imagine yourself on the outside of that stress is often helpful. Another idea is that if you are in a negative mood state and you want to kind of alleviate that negative mood state, is to do something altruistic for somebody.
Yes.
Do something nice for somebody else. Take some flowers to a neighbor, write a card. Just do something altruistic for somebody is often helpful when you're in a negative mood.
And there are things that you can do when your spouse is dealing with negative mood regulation, and there's some things that you can do to co-regulate. Now, we want to make sure that nobody misunderstands. We are not talking about doing things that will lead you eventually to becoming codependent. That is not it at all. But co-regulation is something that we learn really early on, and one of the things that can make it difficult for us to regulate negative mood is not having the co-regulation that we were so used to. Even starting in the womb, we were co-regulating. Our mother's excitement level would actually trigger the excitement level within us before we were born. And I want you to think about this. Most of us have at least one memory where, as a small child, and if you don't have this memory, you've seen other small children do this, where a child will fall down at a playground. And what's the very first thing they do? They look up at their parent to see whether they should be upset or not. Because they realize that what they're feeling is a lot, but they look to mom and dad to see, should I cry or am I okay? And don't devalue that, because even as adults, we still can look to the people we love the most to find out, should I cry or am I okay? And as the assisting spouse, as the spouse who comes in to help co-regulate some of these negative moods, we can look at what God says in Galatians 6:2. Galatians 6:2 says that we're to carry one another's burdens, and in this way we'll fulfill the law of Christ. And so we have an opportunity, not just to love our spouse, but to help carry their burden and to analyze the situation, to look at what's going on, and to help do a little co-regulation.
Mm-hmm. I know you were very helpful for me in this co-regulation process during COVID, when the future was so uncertain, like we didn't know how things were going to play out.
Right.
And at this point, it was very hard to imagine a time past this, because we didn't, I had never lived through a pandemic before. I didn't know what it looked like, how long it could last, what the ramifications were going to be. So I couldn't imagine myself on the outside of that, stress. Right. And so it was very helpful to be able to come alongside and say, okay, let's look at some of these things realistically, right, after we turn off the TV.
Right.
And so,
well, and see, one of the things I'd recommend to you, if you're the spouse who's going to help co-regulate, and again, make sure that it's something that you're both ready for. Please don't push yourself into the situation. Come into the situation and decide as a couple, this is something that's going to be helpful for us. Mm-hmm. When that happens, one of the first things that you can do, if your spouse is struggling with negative mood, is learn to listen. Now, what they're going through may not be the reaction that you would figure is the most appropriate reaction for the circumstance, but what they're feeling is very real. And so learn to listen. When Leslie was dealing with anxiety during COVID, and I was listening to what she was saying, I realized that there were a couple of things that were contributing to that anxiety. I, besides being the pastor, am a history teacher and a history nerd, and so I watched the news a lot, but the news was contributing to her anxiety. And so what I was able to do is I was able to make sure that I got my news after she went to bed instead of while she was awake, because it was something very simple that I could do to help alleviate one of the things that was contributing to that anxiety. But you have to learn to listen to find out what's really going on.
And I think listening to me was also key, because it wasn't just the fact that we turned off the news, but it was the fact that I was able to talk about that in a safe relationship, in a relationship that I knew wasn't going to be judged or condemned or, torn down or whatever. And so that was a safe relationship. And that would be what I would encourage the spouses to do, is to make sure that that relationship is safe with your spouse, that the things that they tell you, you hold dear and hold important and hold with honor.
And integrity. But as you do that, I also want to remind the spouse who's helping co-regulate that you need to remind yourself that your spouse is struggling. Now, I know that again, you think, well, of course they're struggling. That's why we're here. But you need to remind yourself in the midst of the negative mood, my spouse is struggling right now. Because if you don't, it can really feel personal. And so if they're anxious, you can feel like you're not doing a good job protecting them or providing for them. If they're angry, you can think that either that it's absolutely unfair the way they treat you because the anger is coming out towards you, or that you are helpless to be able to fix it. But if you remind yourself, my spouse is struggling, eventually this negative mood will be able to regulate it, but right now it's unregulated, then it feels less personal, and you're able to listen without the hurt getting in the way of hearing what your spouse is actually saying.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that.
Because, too often hurt can get in the way of you being able to hear properly. We all have a tendency, even though we don't like it, we all have a tendency to project. And so if you are dealing with an emotion, you could inadvertently transfer the same motivations you would have towards your spouse, or the hurt that you have towards your spouse. And when you realize they're struggling, it's temporary, they're not going to struggle forever, and you remind yourself of that, you're able to listen a little more clearly. But also make sure that that you are able to set boundaries. We've talked about this with several other episodes, but personally set boundaries of what is and isn't acceptable. If your spouse is dealing with anxiety, you need to be able to set boundaries that, for example, that there can't be name calling, or, if the anxiety leads to some kind of a mechanism that could attack you, say, well, you can tell me about all your concerns, but it's not okay to attack me, those kinds of things. And if you can set those boundaries and stay calm within them, here's one of the things we learned from Melanie Yates, and she was so spot on, but I don't think people realize it. You have the ability to control the emotion in the room more than you think you do.
Influence.
Because if one of us is emotionally unregulated,
Yeah.
and the other one is completely regulated, we come to more of a medium where the unregulated spouse is able to regulate a little more, simply because of the calm environment being able to be put in place by the spouse who's able to stay calm. Melanie talked about how, we our energies kind of merge together, and that's exactly what she was talking about. We are able to help with the situation that feels like it's spiraling. We're able to slow things down. And so don't underestimate your ability to not yell back, to not argue, to not allow your blood pressure to raise just because your spouse is dealing with some negative mood. But instead, you get to come alongside and help them and love them carry their burden in a way that will love them and show them Christ's intention for you as a couple.
And we talked more about anger and anger reactions in a couple today. But next week, we're going to talk about Gottman's 4 horsemen and how those play out in a marriage. And my basic theory is that what happens when you get to that stage is that you have had unregulated negative moods that have taken a serious foothold, that that have become a bitter root, as the Bible says,
and a habit.
And yes, and a habit, and they will turn into Gottman's 4 horsemen. And it once those things begin to operate in your relationship, it's very, very hard to get them turned around. Not impossible, but it's very, very hard to get them turned around. And they have found that of the people that have gotten a divorce, 1 or more of the 4 horsemen have been active in their relationship. And so it's really a precursor to the end of a relationship, and we really don't want to see that. Like, that's not what we're working toward.
And it's fixable. Now, as we wrap up regulating negative mood, one more thing for you spouses who just really want to be as much of a help as you can be. It's going to be really, really less than helpful if you decide that you're going to be a thermometer, and when your spouse is unregulated, to tell them how unregulated they are, how hot the situation is. But instead, what we had just dealt with before we talked about the 4 horsemen, you get the opportunity instead to be more of a thermostat. And as you stay calm, you're able to turn down the heat of the emotion just a little bit. And if you can remember that, rather than pointing out how inappropriate you think a mood is, instead just to be able to calm down and realize my spouse is struggling right now, and to be able to love them in a way that will allow them to see that you hear them, what they're feeling, you at least understand what they're telling you about what they're feeling, that you're going to be there with them and come alongside to help them carry that burden so that they can regulate that mood.
Absolutely. It also works on the cold side.
Yes.
You were talking about a mood reaction being hot, like
yes.
Assumingly anger or whatever. But if your spouse is despondent and cold, there's that's also a negative mood. And so
Right.
being able to talk about that as a negative mood,
Right.
kind of works in the same way.
Absolutely. And so we want to thank you all for listening today as we've looked at how to regulate a negative mood. There's some things that you can do that can really benefit you and benefit your spouse. And of course, if you're struggling with any of these things, there is help available. There's lots of places you can seek help, and we would encourage you to do so if you find yourself at a place where you need more than what you can try to plug in on your own.
Yes, I would say don't be afraid to seek help when you need help.
And so again, we want to thank you for listening to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast, where we pray that God will solidify your marriage.